Good afternoon, everyone. This is, of course, the sleepy time of the day after lunch, but I was assured that since our panelists are the most exciting of the lot of speakers, that we're going to keep everyone awake. But I might turn to you from time to time and suddenly ask you what you last heard, so stay awake. I'll start with a note of commiseration for our colleague, the very well-known Bangladeshi photographer Shahidul Alam, whose large shoes I'm not trying to fill, but he was supposed to be actually here moderating this panel, and many of you will be familiar with his work because he has been a stalwart activist using both his craft and his personal space to forward issues of justice in Bangladesh. He is currently in jail. Today is the 61st day that he has been in jail without being granted bail because he spoke out against what the government was doing to protesting students. And he has been arrested under a particularly restrictive act called the Internet Communication Act, ICT Act, which restricts what journalists and others can do, and you can be arrested on the flimsiest ground and then denied bail. And the government plans to further strengthen it. So I think just like our last panel was saying, there are increasing challenges, and it's really interesting to be part of this. I thank the organizers for inviting me to this. It's an important moment in time for all of us to be talking about these challenges, and we have very interesting speakers on our panel. So I think what we can do with this session, the last session laid out a lot of broad themes, but now we have people who are practitioners on the ground. So it's a kind of, could be a panel to test how these theories, challenges operate from people who've been working on the ground and how they see the issues which were being discussed earlier in the morning. I'll keep the introductions very brief, but of course you will hear more about them and their work as we go along. I'll start by introducing Hana Makai. She's a Reuters photographer based in London, but has done some stellar work in photographing the Rohingya, for which her photograph won the Pulitzer Prize for Reuters earlier this year. We have Patrick Brown, an award-winning photographer as well, who's worked a lot in Africa and Asia, and also whose photograph on the Rohingya refugees got an award, apart from many, many awards he has got, which I will not list. And we have Matthew Smith from Fortify Rights, who has been working since 2005 in this region. And on Myanmar, he's been working on Myanmar since 2005 and set up Fortify Rights in 2013, which is looking at Myanmar, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. And we have Minzao O. Could we get him in while I introduce him? So Minzar O started, I think, as a medical student and became a photographer. He worked with Reuters, but now is an independent photographer. Hello, Minzar.
Hello, hi everyone. Hi.
Good to have you here digitally, if not in person, and I hope you'll be able to participate for the fullest extent in this panel.
Yeah, I'm also sorry that I couldn't make it, but I'm glad that I could join somehow.
I think you need to adjust your laptop screen. We're only getting your forehead.
Okay. Oh, I'm not seeing my.
The first position was good.
Oh, all right, good. Yeah.
While you adjust that, I was just introducing you. So since I didn't have a chance to talk, I went online. You need to move a little bit more to get your face on screen.
Okay.
Oh,
Would you like
I think the problem is at our end. Okay.
Okay.
So, Minzer, I read somewhere that you actually sold a piano to become a photographer. Is that a myth or is that a reality?
Yeah, that's actually a reality because when I started in 2010, like when I first picked up a camera, I was still studying medicine, and my parents were not approving that I was going to I was going to try photography. So I sold my piano and then bought my first camera.
W-
So sorry.
Minzer, if you can zoom out of your laptop, I think that is, you're too close to it perhaps.
Um, no, yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, we'll move on while this gets sorted out, hopefully.
On my
Uh,
screen, it shows that I'm right in the center of the screen, but
do you think if you Okay, while we wait for Minz to be dialed in again, I'll start by asking Hannah. Um, you joined the Reuters and presumably received all their training, but in a very short space of time, you had to go and report on the Rohingya crisis.
yeah, it should be
Ah,
obvious.
Minzal, that's great. Now we have you right in center. So I'm just starting with asking Hannah a question, and perhaps after that we'll move to you. Um, so Hannah, how was the transition from what you learned, let's say in the training course, to what you actually faced in terms of ethical issues on the ground?
Hello, everybody. So I joined Reuters, and they put you through a hostile environment course, which is like a 5-day course about preparing yourself for hostile environments, and it covers a wide range of situations. All that is I'm not used to working in the UK. And about 2 weeks after the course finished, I was sent to Bangladesh to cover the Rohingya crisis. And it was a very, very different way of working. I'd say in the UK, there's a negativity around photographers and cameras, whereas I felt more in Bangladesh, people welcomed you taking their picture. And obviously there's a language barrier there, but the camera is a universal symbol, and if people don't want their picture taken, then they'll tell you. But actually, 9 times out of 10, I found that everybody welcomed you as a photographer, and whether or not they knew the outcome of taking those photos or what, but it's almost like they saw that as a universal symbol of hope, that I was there to be able to tell their story. But I did find some situations challenging. Could we show the picture? This picture that we're about to look at is a situation that I was in, and it was physically demanding, but it was also morally challenging. This lady, there was a crossing from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and this was at the River Naf, and there was thousands of refugees making their way through. And this lady couldn't get up the riverbank. She was absolutely exhausted, and she was really trying to pull herself up to carry on with the journey. And she just had nothing left in her to give. So as I was with 3 other photographers, and we were sat at the top of the riverbank, and the other refugees were trying to help her, but we could see that she needed help from other people. So we intervened, and so pulled her up and got her to safety. And it was a real moment of separating your head and your heart. And at the time, this picture got a lot of coverage, and I think it's probably because you can see the white hand in the frame, so it gives a sense of two worlds colliding. And it was a difficult moment, but it was a breaking news situation where the adrenaline is running and it takes over, and it's only afterwards when you sit back and think about actually what happened in that situation. But there was a few situations like this where you have to put your camera down and help. And so obviously I didn't at this particular moment because we wouldn't have got the picture, but I did put the camera down afterwards and helped pull her onto the bank. And I think it's important to remember that what goes on before and after a picture's taken, it's very easy to blame a photographer for taking an image without caring about the subject, when actually situations like this did arise, and we did stop to make sure that we're all human at the end of the day, so we stopped to help the people in the picture. But then you also have to remember that you've got a job to do, and you've got a responsibility as a photographer to the subject, to the story, and to the world, really, to show everybody what's going on there. So, yeah.
I think we'll come back to some of the other challenges that you were talking about later in the discussion. But if I can go to Minzao while we have him. Minzao, could you talk to us a little bit about the moment that you decided you wanted to be a photographer, and you were saying that your parents didn't like it. And Hannah has been just talking about how she felt photographers were seen as a symbol of hope, unlike in the UK, in the camps where she was photographing. What is the reception or receptivity to photographers in Myanmar? And that also must have changed in the years that you've been doing this work.
Yeah. So when I started, I remember I just started to take photos of landscapes and of the cities and nature, because before, as far as I remember, before 2010-11, it wasn't possible to really be a photojournalist, because it was even risky to walk around town taking pictures of the street. But then after when Daw Aung San Suu Kyi got released from house arrest, and then they were going to enter the by-election, they started the campaigns for the by-election in the country, and many young people, including me, thought this was going to be historic, and we wanted to try and follow and photograph the campaign. So I also joined this group of people, following the campaign and photographing. And it was a time, I remember, it was very hopeful, and we were witnessing something that we've never seen in a long time. And then after 2012, that was when many young generation of journalists and photographers started to work with the transition of the country. Yeah.
And do you think people in Myanmar see a role for the photographer, or how do people receive you when you go with the camera?
Back then, it was very much easier, walking on the streets and taking pictures. People were still very friendly, and because before that we didn't have many journalists and media coverage, so that was also the first time for everybody to see people photographing on the streets. And I thought it was still very welcoming. But as over the years, as more issues escalated, and there's more and more mistrust towards the media nowadays. Yeah, especially after this Rohingya crisis, and yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Minzao. I'll now come to Patrick, perhaps. Patrick, you are much younger than you look, but
Be careful. Be careful.
but yeah, that came out quite the wrong way. what I really wanted to say was that the issues of ethics of representation were not being discussed until very recently. And then I wanted to pay you a compliment by saying that maybe the ethics of representation were just started to being discussed when you entered photojournalism, and then it came out all wrong. I apologize. But you were also talking about how you have a lot of concern when you take photographs about which ones you pick for representation. And I'm wondering how that relationships with the ethics of what you're photographing has evolved for you.
First of all, I'm 49. Okay, I will be turning 50 in January, so any gifts, I'll take them lightly.
In my defense, I'm older.
But you look much younger. It's really difficult. This discussion comes up quite a lot. Every incident, or when it becomes quite sensitive, there's a whole new template. You're going into a structure, you're going into a whole society that you're somewhat approaching it from a remote perspective. Maybe I should rewind a little bit. When I take photographs, when I go to a country, I don't do research in the sense of visual literacy. I do research on data, population, disease, all those, the data. I try not to taint myself with other people's perception of that country or that place, either a national or an international person. I want to see it through the naivety of my own existence in that position. So I take that naivety, but somewhat a perspective that is coming from a human instinct. These people, especially the images that are up there now, are very difficult to take. It's not something that you take very lightly. You literally are walking around dead people, and you have to navigate that as if it's. I don't want to use the word in any disrespect, but a light dance. You're dealing with people's emotions and many spectrums, and you have to navigate the emotions as well as your own emotions. You need to put them aside, because there's nothing more condescending as a photographer or documentation, somebody working in the documentation world, is if you were to break down. I mean, you're there to do a purpose. Yes, it doesn't mean the image doesn't affect me. It doesn't mean that the situation doesn't affect me. I'm not discarding that at all. But at the situation of the time, you really need to have a balance between the aesthetics and the message, and almost the human voice within your own chest. As you can see for the next couple of images, I took a wide picture, and then I took a medium picture, and then I took a tight picture. Could you move forward one slide, please? Yeah. So this is the image that was published. It wasn't. There was a bit of distance. There's a bit of context to it all, and that's what the editors thought was the image. It wasn't until I went back over the images a couple of days later that I decided that it was another image. And if you could go to that slide now, that would be great. So, ironically, that one had never been published before until the World Press picked it up. Now, ethics. It doesn't, even to this day, it doesn't sit well on my shoulders that I won an award for this image. But this image isn't about me. It never was about me. It was the World Press, the judges who are visually literate, incredibly articulately placed politically. And they thought that this image was the best image to portray the Rohingya crisis. Because how do you photograph something that you cannot photograph? There's no photographers allowed into northern Rakhine State. So everything was past tense. but this was a position of presence. These were a death, a preventable death, and there is just as much victim on the Bangladesh side of the border as they are on the Burmese side. Getting back to your ethics, I think it boils down to the individual. I don't see myself as a photographer. I see myself as somebody that takes pictures. And before that, I think I'm a person that looks a little bit older than they should, but I'm a person. And I think it comes down to the personality of the individual, not the discipline of photography. We keep putting photography on the chopping block here. It's the individual that's doing the documentation, not photography. Was it? Yeah, I think that was my answer.
I think there are lots of issues to unpack in that, and we will as we discuss further things. But if I can come to you, Matthew. Young Patrick was just mentioning about the purpose of as a photographer. Now in Fortify Rights, unlike all the other three who've spoken earlier, I think it's much more about advocacy. What kind of a shift does that make to how you see the use of photography?
That's a great question. For us, there's a overriding evidentiary value that we bring to the work when we're assessing, for example, what video to use or what images to use. There are three, and I think actually from our perspective as a human rights organization, ethics permeate everything that we do. Perhaps to a fault in some situations, but Fortify Rights, there are three basic components to our work. We're doing in-depth investigations, so we're getting as close as possible to where human rights violations are taking place. We're documenting, doing in-depth investigations. The second part is we're doing engagement. So we're identifying people in positions of power who can change negative outcomes to positive outcomes. The third part of our work, which in some ways I think differentiates Fortify Rights a bit from some other organizations, is we provide support to activists, human rights defenders, directly affected communities. So that comes in the form of workshops, trainings, facilitating access to people in power for people who otherwise wouldn't have that access. And this is a big part of our organization's work. It's also the least publicized aspect of it. But in all of those different things, there are ethical considerations, particularly with regard to the use of visual media. And so I think that certainly factors into it. And we have policies and we have internal guidelines that help us decide, make decisions, as I'm sure other organizations do as well. But I think in terms of what the decisions that are made, if we know certain crimes are being perpetrated and we've conducted those investigations and we're confident of it, there are certain types of media that will help make that case. So for example, if we're trying to hold a perpetrator accountable or advocating for an international court to get jurisdiction or what have you, visual media is extremely important. I was talking earlier, we've had some cases where we could document at length in written form human rights violations, and certain government officials will just dismiss it every time. There was an instance a year or so ago where we released some short footage of military officers committing torture, and this immediately elicited a response from the authorities and from the Myanmar military. And so I think there's some important lessons to be learned there about evidentiary thresholds in terms of getting governments to change bad behavior to better behavior.
You're talking about the evidentiary nature of the work that you do. And the Rohingya crisis, of course, has been one where journalists, activists, and I'd like to address this to all three of you perhaps, but especially photographers have not just been witness, but what they've witnessed and documented has played a large role in actually enabling people to investigate these crimes. And yet, I think you are all also covering an area where access is extremely restricted. That's quite an interesting duality. Patrick, would you like to speak a little bit to that?
Restricted realities. I mean, that's the nature of the beast in the type of work that I do. I will. The Rohingya crisis for me, I've steered clear of it. I've more focused my Burma work on the eastern borders, so the Kachin, the Shan, and Cayenne. It's been and the Mon, of course, have been my main focus, and I sort of stayed clear of the Rohingya crisis because it's a very difficult. It doesn't mean it's not so hard on the eastern border, but it's a very difficult one to get into because it opens up a large area. So we have to remember that this crisis we're talking about is a contemporary crisis. It's been going on repeatedly, 72, 75, 80s, and in the 90s. And I thought that I'd sort of come late to that, and I stayed clear of it. But also, selfishly, I also stayed clear of it because I realized it was incredibly difficult to document. You really want to get to the nature of it, you need to get into Sittwe and then move out of Sittwe and up into the hills, which is almost impossible if you look like me. So selfishly I stayed away from it, and it sort of opened up for me, not intentionally. It opened up when the borders sort of opened up to some degree, and for the first time I was hearing stories from individuals that would make your blood run cold, and it made me more driven than I've ever been to tell their story, because I realized how isolated I have been, and I think I'm fairly informed about Burma. I'd suddenly seen the western border as an incredibly diverse, difficult subject matter to document, and that to me is one of the reasons I do what I do, is because it's a story that needs and must be told.
And our missing colleague Shahidul Alam is someone, of course, who's done stellar work on documenting the Rohingya crisis from Bangladesh, which has become the place from which a lot of people are working to document this. You were talking just now about the trauma and witnessing and documenting some of these issues, and I'm wondering if this is a good time to talk about some of that. But perhaps I'd like to go to you, Hannah, now, and since this was one of your first experiences in a situation like this, what was the emotional response that you had, and how did you deal with it, both individually, and were you even offered some kind of practical help when you returned from the field?
Yeah, so I was there for nearly 3 weeks, and the first half of the trip was I was almost eased into the story because it was daily life in the camps, and it was going around and listening to stories of the refugees and documenting their life now they're settling into Bangladesh. And then the picture that we looked at earlier of the lady being pulled out of the mud, that was a situation that arose as a breaking news situation, and up to 5,000 refugees were crossing the border. And this was the moment where I realised the severity of the story. I was there until sundown, and so you realise then that the lights go out and they're still there, and they sit at the river overnight while you go back to your hotel and freshen up and get a good night's sleep. So you do carry some guilt with that, because as a human you want to help them. So I was faced with situations like this. There was also situations with people who had died, and photographing dead people, which isn't something that's ever happened before, and that was quite eye-opening as well. So I forgot what the question was. Sorry.
How did you actually come to terms with
Oh, yeah.
this? And were you actually offered any kind of
Yeah, so
counseling and the practical aspect of what you've been through, you'll probably go through again, and what a lot of journalist students in this room will face in the future?
Yeah.
Is there a practical component to dealing with this kind of an issue?
I mean, I think everybody's different and people deal with situations differently. Whilst I was there, I was almost in a work bubble, and you're able to hide behind the camera almost. And so once I returned, I had a conversation with one of my bosses, who sat me down and said, "Are you okay? Do you need anything? And there's this and this in place." So Reuters is very good for making sure out of the field afterwards there's a support network for you. Fortunately, I haven't had to use it, and I always feel like I would like to go back, and I hope that door is open, because I feel like the story is still ongoing, and as a photographer and a person who's been there, I would like to return to be able to continue that work.
Minziar, if I can ask you at this point, I think all our other three panelists are those who visit the places that they're documenting, and they do have the option of leaving. But you are bearing witness in a place which is also your own country. That must be so much harder. And I'm also assuming that support systems for what you're doing, whether within your peer group or through some other forms of support, must be very rudimentary, if they exist at all. Can you talk to us about this aspect? We can't hear you. 1 second, Minzia, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was, nowadays it's surely a very difficult subject to report on here, especially 1 year in Myanmar. But if I can go through a bit of my coverage from the beginning, and I remember there was like 2012 June, that was when it first happened. There was a story of a Rakhine girl who was raped and murdered, and then there was this photo, the graphic photo of the body of the girl surfaced on Facebook, and many people were furious, and because the rumor was that she was raped and killed by the Burmese, by the Muslims, which was not confirmed. And then in response, there was, like a few days later, a mob stopped a bus and killed 10 Muslim men who were traveling on it. And that was how the violence really started. And back then I remember media access was still much better. Like even though it wasn't open yet for foreigners to go, like many local journalists could go even to the front line and cover the very crisis. I couldn't go back then, because I just started working with Reuters and I haven't completed my hostile environment management training. But my other friends and colleagues went there. The initial story was that these Rohingya Muslims were like burning their own houses, and then attacking the Rakhine villages. But then, like, as more media got reports and access, I remember a friend of mine, especially a friend of mine, took a really great picture of this young Rakhine man walking with weapons in his hand, and then another colleague like interviewed him as in the background of him is like burning a Muslim village. And another colleague interviewed him, and he said, "Oh yeah, we just came out. We just burned the Muslim village back there." So that was when the perspective of the people changed, and then start to realize, oh, there's a really communal violence happening between the two. And then after June violence in 2012 October, that was the first time I could go to cover the crisis myself, and I went with another colleague, and we were doing a report on the aftermath. So I went to a town called Chakpyu. It's in the southern part of Rakhine State. Let me run through some photos from there. Sorry. Yeah. So this is Chakpyu, and there was a whole village, Muslim village, which was burned during the conflict, and 891 houses were destroyed. Almost all of the Muslims from the town got displaced. And this is a letter a word that says like Rakhine Buddhist home, and hang with a picture of a pagoda. This is from the aftermath. And so after that violence, so the 2012 violence left like almost 200 killed, and then displaced 140,000 people who were now living in the camps, and still stuck in these camps in Sittwe. So, and then back then the violence was still very much an anti-Muslim form, and then it spread it to other parts of the country, like into Meghtila or to Shan State or to other places. In 2014, I went to cover the health crisis in the camps in Sittwe, because the government expelled major aid groups that were like giving treatment giving support to the Rohingya. And some mobs attacked the NGO offices. That's why this is pictures from the health crisis in 2014. And people were like, because some clinics that were operating in the camps were not operating anymore, so people were depending on the makeshift clinics, and most of the clinics don't have proper medicines, and like expired medicines like this one here. And in 2014 November, I had rare access to go to Mongdo, and I think it was quite an important trip, because when people, like especially nationalists here, talk about this issue, they always point at Mongdo as saying like there's all these. Mongdo is the northern Rakhine State, and in Mongdo there's so many Muslims, but not very few Rakhine Buddhists. So out of like 510,000 people, only like 30,000 are Rakhine or non-Muslims. So we got a rare access to go and report there on how the Rakhines were besieged by the Muslims. But of course, they had like always support and protection from the authorities. So this is before all this violence happened in 2017. And this is a school it's a government school where the Rohingya Muslim kids attend. And I met this school teacher who was teaching there. And that time I remember many Rohingya Muslims were trying to leave the country for Malaysia and Thailand by boat. And this teacher was saying like he would rather remain here and teach at the school rather than leaving. So that was really remarkable. And this is a picture of a Rakhine boy who's like using internet with a Bangladeshi cell. And in 2015, I did a story on the Skype. On how like people were using an internet hut in the camps in Sittwe to communicate to those who were leaving by boat for Malaysia and Thailand and got like kidnapped by human traffickers at the border. And then in 2017, last year, I went to photograph the crisis because that time already it's very difficult to go to Rakhine State, not even to Mongdo, but even to go to the camps, it was very difficult, almost no access. So I tried to go to Bangladesh. I was on assignment, and I went to photograph Exodus. I could only photograph for about a day before getting detained because I went in with a tourist visa. Sorry, I ran through a lot of photos.
Thanks for that, Minzia. That gives us a really a good overview of what has been happening over a period of time.
Yeah.
I'd like to use that as a departure point to get to some of the issues which were being discussed earlier in the morning. And perhaps, Matthew, I'll start with you. The issue of consent. We've seen some very compelling pictures from all the three photographers, and the issue of getting consent from the people you're photographing. I'm wondering if you can start off the discussion on this about what you think about how consent is and can be practiced.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's obviously really important, particularly when you're documenting human rights violations and there are security concerns. For us, we're quite strict on consent. You know, it has to be free, prior, informed. Very important questions which you had raised earlier about, you know, the extent to which you can establish meaningful consent with an individual who, you know, may not have access to all the resources that everybody in this room has access to. But we have seen some, you know, I've personally, in documenting human rights violations in this case, or, you know, in working with members of the news media, we have seen some quite concerning behavior. And I think to David's point this morning that, you know, in analyzing the bad behavior, it helps point us toward the direction of the better behavior. And I'll give you an example. Like, you know, a film crew comes in, and it's a Rohingya refugee who they want to speak to, and that person gets mic'd up, you know, and he's kind of uncomfortable what's going on here, and then they're getting cameras set up, and somebody's getting set, you know, they're sitting down and they're speaking a language that that person doesn't understand, and then they go through the process of getting consent, and at that point it's already coercive because there's a power dynamic there where the person from the community is now faced with a litany of foreigners in front of them, expensive hardware and equipment in their face, and they're already wearing a microphone. And so the extent to which this type of behavior is common is really, really disturbing. So I think there has to be an industry-wide reckoning with that. And it can lead to problematic situations because there are people who would be very willing to speak, to participate in the truth-telling process, but they might not want their identity revealed. And so with all of our reporting, for most of the time, at least with the written material, we will change people's names. It's very clear in our methodology, and that's usually for security purposes. That said, there are a lot of people who, you know, they are you know, aggressively engaging in truth telling, and they want their stories told, and they, you know, and I think there are plenty of those examples as well. But I think you know, it's a case by case basis, certainly. But I think consent is absolutely important for the most part, just to prevent any sort of unwanted security problems.
Patrick, if I can come to you on this issue, as Matthew was saying, what does real consent mean? You're working in situations where people come from perhaps very different backgrounds. They may not have the tools to understand uh, even what you're doing with their photographs. So, what does constitute consent? Is it just someone nodding and saying, yeah, okay, I don't really understand what you're doing? Or do you actually take time to explain to them? And even so, can they understand where your photograph is finally going to end up?
So how I normally operate, and my colleagues that are doing the writing, is that we usually work in two different situations. Is I usually let the writer do their thing, and I do my thing afterwards or before. And it's a cooperative situation. I might meet somebody that I feel that the writer should meet, and vice versa. So let's just set that particular political scope, disarm it in some way. When it comes to photographing people, I ask them 4 to 5 different ways, because again, the power dynamic that Matt just mentioned is, particularly in Southeast Asia, most people don't like to say no. So you need to word it in different ways and come from it from multiple angles. And one of the things that I always say to them, I'll be just as happy if you say no as if you'll say yes. It doesn't make any difference to me. It's about you. So try and use that. If there's anything I can offer anybody, use multiple ways to ask the same question. And also do that methodology when you're asking questions about what they're talking about. Try and find timelines and get the details right. So that's how I ask it. Could you possibly bring up the picture, the portrait of her name is Regina. It's just the vertical. It's the third from that one.
Would you ask these questions before or after taking the photo?
This is where I'm going to come to the latter of that particular question. Regina really got to me. She's, of all my career, I've kept these dams and blockages in place where I don't allow people in. And I don't mean that, and I don't mean, I'm being honest with you. You need to set up some firewalls. And again, wrong terminology, but you need to set up some things because you're dealing with situations that are not your environment. And one of the things that I was taught by such people like Matthew and other Human Rights Watch lawyers and activists is try to stay away from the emotions of when you're questioning somebody. And when you're asking questions, stay to the details. What was the insignia that the soldiers, what color uniform, what was the hats, what they were wearing, did the weapons look like? Steer away from the emotions, because try to keep things on a factual basis. One, it protects the individual that you're interviewing because you don't want to take them back emotionally to that place because they're already vulnerable. And two, you also need to keep the emotions out of it for factual information. Regina got through me. I've seen this lady now 20, 30 times. And she's 20 years old, and she had a 3-year-old child pulled from her arms and stomped on, and the skull was crushed, and then he was thrown on a fire and burnt alive. And then the soldiers collected her with a bunch of other ladies and put her in a house and raped her multiple times. And she escaped through a hole in the back. And no other woman came out of that fire, as she says. Now, I was shocked when she was telling me, and I could see my translator was really taken back about how to translate that for me, because they were also, you also think about your translator, fixer. I mean, when most of us are not trained in dealing with that type of information. It comes with years of experience. And so on that information, these pictures, I withheld them for It was shot in November and they didn't get published until, I think, April. And all the women from this series of portraits I did on Tuli Tuli Massacre, I repeatedly went back and I saw them. And it was, these pictures of Regime are already public and a lot of the portraits, right? But this was for me. I needed to know that I was doing the right thing by her. And I asked her, I said, do you know when I mean the world will know about this event? When she's pregnant again, and I think the baby is due now. So when her child is maybe 5 or 6 years old, maybe older, will Google her name, you know what will come up? And this was such an arrogant Western's perspective of a situation. I was coming with my own values. And she looked at me, she said, Patrick, I am illiterate, but I'm not dumb. I know there's a world out there. And that this needs to be told. And I did nothing wrong. They did wrong. Why should I hide? Now, I dealt with that for a little while, and I talked to a lot of people who are very close to me about it. And would I treat her any differently if this was a court case in Birmingham, London, New York? Would I photograph her any differently? If there was somebody who would have the same situation, all the same set of events that had happened to her, would I still photograph her? And she was still willing to be identified? Yes, I would. Why should I not let her have the right to tell the world? And I feel like I was doing the right thing. I've met her many times, I've talked to her, and she understands what the internet is. She understands that people will know about this, and she is not ashamed of it. She obviously it's affected her beyond belief, but she did nothing wrong. I know that I did everything in my power to make sure that I was doing the right thing. And that's all I can add to anybody here when you talk to ethics. If you stick to what you believe is right, and you stick to that compass, you are doing the right thing, depending on obviously your north. But it's about the individual that you're photographing or the situation.
That's really moving. Hannah, if I can come to you on the issue of consent. You're working with the news agency, and as we were hearing earlier in the day from Philip and others, that it's a lot about speed when you're working with the news agency. How do you go about securing consent if you do, and where do you seek consent? Some of your photographs will obviously perhaps not show the face, but they could show the person. What yardsticks do you use?
I completely agree with everything you've just said. On the other side to consent, to what Patrick was just talking about, is often in situations it's not possible to get consent off every person that you're photographing. There's a few photographs that Jennifer can show. Yeah, please. There's a couple after the. So the first lady that we saw her cry, and I was able to spend some time with her and a translator, and we heard her story, and we sat down, and she wanted to tell us about it, and she wanted her story heard. But then a few slides in, this kind of situation, these situations here where there's mass amounts of people, and it's impossible to get consent off these people, not only for my time, but for their time. They've just been given permission to continue crossing into Bangladesh from Bangladesh government in this photo, having sat at the riverside for 2 days and 2 nights. So for me to stop them in their tracks would have been unfair. So in that kind of situation, it's really difficult to ask for their permission. Also, another thing is people make it clear if they don't want to be photographed. So sometimes it's not necessarily asking them if they do, but if they show signs of they don't want to be photographed, then you respect that. You respect the fact that we may not speak the same language, but they've signalled it's a no. There's another situation in a few slides down. So this young girl was in a children's centre, and she struck me by her appearance, and she was a very happy little soul. And so I wanted to find out a little bit more about her story. So I checked with the teachers if it was okay to speak to her, and also she had an older sibling with her. So through a translator, we were able to sit down and ask her some questions about the little girl. And then just continuing about not showing people's identity. There's ways around shooting to illustrate the story. You know, it's not necessarily showing somebody's face. Ways like this, and also there's two pictures that are very similar here. I was in a hospital waiting area. Felt quite uncomfortable about being there because it's not the kind of access you get in the UK. There's no way you would be allowed into a hospital with your camera. And I was in there with this lady who was waiting for her husband to come and see their children that had died in a boat that had collapsed very recently. But there was no indication as that they didn't want me to be there. So I stayed and I took some pictures. And I thought to myself, if when the father comes in, they don't want me here and they want some privacy, then I would have left immediately. But they didn't. And so I stayed and I tried to be as sensitive as possible. And the next frame is, I think, it doesn't necessarily show the faces of the children that had died, but it's a way of illustrating the story without desensitizing it. It's obvious, well, to me, it's obvious that what's going on here. So I just wanted to show two different ways of being able to show how we can illustrate a story with not necessarily identifying people's faces. And also often it's a lot about having a conversation with the editor. So you shoot pictures, and then the next step is to edit and send them to the editors, and then they have a final say of what to do next, whether to put them on the wire or whether to not put them on the wire. And so it's important to have that because you're caught up in the moment as a photographer, taking these pictures and being in that situation, but actually it's their decision as to whether they want the world to see what's happening here. And both of those pictures did go on the wire, but they go on the wire with a warning to editors in the caption that there's graphic content in them, which then gives them another level of whether they want to use them and what's in the picture. So there's ways around illustrating death and violence and sexual harassment victims.
Related to consent, but another dimension is keeping the people you photograph safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, of course, much trickier, especially if you're photographing people who are perhaps speaking out against the perpetrators of the violence. How do you actually achieve that? Do you never show their face? I'm assuming if you're working for a news agency, you wouldn't be able to change the name, as perhaps Matthew can do. So how do you deal with the aspect of security?
I mean, I haven't been put into a situation like that, so I don't know if you have, but there comes the situation where does the person you're photographing truly understand where the pictures may end up? We often don't know ourselves when you put pictures on the newswire. So I think personally I would encourage not to show their identity, just for a safety factor of making sure that it's not going to have repercussions on them. Even if you were to say, do you want to be photographed? I think I would prefer to not take that risk for both of us.
What about you, Patrick?
Ultimately, it's the personal safety. I mean, an image it's not worth the risk of somebody's safety and security. It's a, I think it's all about informing the person that you're photographing. I think that's the key to it, is to give them as much information as possible. If it comes down to identity, there is ways around it, and if you could possibly show my last slide, which is an image that was used as well. There's simple tricks in the trade, so to speak, but ultimately there's some images that I have taken through my career which I think are really quite powerful, but they've never been used due to personal safety of the individual. That's my personal choice. I don't think there is a code of ethics. Maybe there is, Eric, I don't know. But ultimately, it's on your head. And if you've got to think like that, if something happens to this person, you're the one that's liable. And if you think like that, you will think very cautiously about what you will release to the outside world. And that's the code of ethic I have inside me when it deals with those sensitive information or sensitive details.
Minziar, is there something you want to add to this? Because your context may also be a little different, that sometimes you are photographing the community within which you live. One second, the sound needs to be turned on. 1 second, Minziar.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be really sensitive and risky for the person that you're talking to, or you're photographing. Like there have been reported few cases where because nowadays, because you can't go to Northern Rakhine State on your own, the government organized press trips for media and journalists. And there was a few cases where somebody who spoke to the journalist in trying to give a hint of the reality there got questioned afterwards or even killed. So I think it's really important to because it's a choice for them. Of course, it's a right for them, but also it's also even better how this could impact. And I think it's very important to try and explain it to them. Not just can I take your picture, or can you talk to us, but try to explain what could happen to the extent as best as you can. And also I think I have to think whether is it really necessary for the story, or to put somebody at risk. Because I think it's, for me, there's no story that's worth risking anybody's life in. Yeah.
Matthew, you want to add?
Yeah, I would just like to just to add that I think also it's important to consider that it's not only about what photos or what information will be shared with the outside world or the wider world. It's also about how information is managed internally or as an individual or whatever. So I think it's really important, particularly in situations like this with the Rohingya crisis, where there are certain authorities in Myanmar who would absolutely like to do harm to people who are engaged in truth telling, and so it's very important to make sure that any information that could lead to somebody getting in some sort of trouble is handled securely. There's a whole lot of photos and a whole lot of information that never sees the light of day. That we as an organization. We use certain encryption technologies and things like that to make sure that our information is safe. But I just wanted to mention that because it's neglecting that aspect of it, just the day-to-day management of information, could also lead to some problems.
We're going to open up the floor in a minute, so do get ready with questions that you might have. But as a last question from me, we heard in the last panel, Julia was talking about, I think, the competition between, to get photographs which one worse than the other. If somebody's photographed a body part, somebody else body, somebody else is looking for a body part, that kind of a competition. And what one sees in the public domain is that violence and horrific images seem to trump other kinds of images. And yet in situations of conflict, situations of human deprivation, there are of course so many more aspects which are not necessarily extremely brutal, violent, or horrifying. But if you as a photographer may be photographing all those dimensions, what gets picked up, what eventually gets sold or distributed, do you find that it reduces your work as a photographer to more black and white than you would like it to be? Patrick, perhaps?
Yeah, there's one thing that we haven't talked about, which is an incredibly valid point or angle, is the audience. Now, talking about Taiwan and the cars, and is it news? Is it? I mean, it looks to me to be more clickbait than actually clarifying news. It seems to be driven by traffic, internet, social media traffic. There's something that we haven't not talking about, is the education of societies regarding what is news and what isn't news. That is not being talked about. It's always being put on the pretense of the photographer and the deliverer of the media, not actually the person that's consuming it. It's like, well, we only build the guns, we don't shoot them type argument in some sense. It's just as valid. It's what the audience looks at and reads at drives the market of AFP, Reuters, and all the rest. They want this traffic. So I think society needs to take a good hard look at itself, and the educational platforms that start from a very young age right up to adolescence and to university. That I think is really important.
Minziar, is this something that you'd like to talk about? I think you are now working independently, and therefore perhaps the pressure to produce images which are picked up would be even greater than if you're working within an institution. One second again, Minziar, the sound needs to be turned on. 1 second.
Yeah, I would also agree with the point that Patrick made, that I think it's also really important that the society really needs to be educated in following the news as well, because in Myanmar nowadays, like although we have internet access, but Facebook actually is the internet here, where like everybody, like with the popularity of Facebook, people stop even like reading newspapers and rather like following whatever is viral on Facebook. So it's really easy to manipulate, and also it creates a large market for like this sort of clickbait stuff. So I think it's very important to try and give awareness in that sector. Yeah, but that's my point as well here.
Hannah, Matthew, do you want to add anything to it?
I think from a photographer's point of view, you don't always necessarily know which pictures are going to be picked up and which pictures are going to have more publicity than others. Often you will see the worst of the worst being used, but it's important to remember that we cover the whole story. So it is, again, like Patrick said, often down to the audience, not necessarily the photographer. It's not like necessarily go looking for just those types of photos, but when they're in front of you, you can't ignore them.
I think also like it's very important to, because even though we are photographers, because photographers tend to look for the strongest visual narrative or visual points in going to to report on a story. I think, but in doing that, I think it's very important to try and really understand the story and understand the context, because after I think it's after that we can only only then we can accurately like reflect what the context that we understood and try to visualize that. So instead of running around searching for like the strongest or the most graphic pictures, or to try to understand the context and follow the real story, I think it's important to try and do it that way.
On that point of the audience, the importance of it, the limitations of it, I'd like to turn to the audience and invite questions. First here and then here.
So hi, I'm a student studying at City University of Hong Kong. So I'm interested in journalism. So that's why I'm here. So my question is: so recently there was an arrest in Myanmar where 2 journalists were arrested because they uncovered an atrocity by the the Rohingya crisis. So they were journalists from Reuters. So what's your take on that? My question's mainly for Hannah and Minziar. Like, what do you think about it, or like your opinion? Yeah.
Do you want me to go first? So it's important to remember that these 2 journalists were reporting on facts. Reuters' policy is a strenuously impartial way of gathering information, and they were unjustly arrested, and they should be released from prison. But press freedom is something that's really important everywhere in the world, and so I think it's important that we're raising awareness of the fact that they were just doing their job and they were just reporting factually on the story, and actually now that they're in prison is wrongdoing. So and it could happen anywhere. So yeah.
Minziar, do you want to add anything to it?
Yeah, the work that our friends Walon and Joso did was really important, and and it really brought here the first ever evidence, and also it brought to the military like admitting that the security forces some security forces were involved in that massacre. This is the work they did, but the other thing is that like many people here like who kind of want them to be like sentenced, they thought that they were like in prison for doing this story. Actually, it's when the judge actually sentenced them, it's not even that, it's some other like some other reasons that's not even like strong enough. And it's, I think there was a it really kind of sent a message to other journalists who are trying to do like important stories here, and or like critical issues, especially like this this Rakhine crisis. To it's so there's a lot. It brought a lot more like self-censorship for especially for like young journalists, and also it brought like a lot of concern to the families of the journalists here. So but despite that, many journalists here are still like supporting and standing with the 2, and also they never, in all these court hearings and even on the day they got sentenced, they never showed any weakness or any they stood up really strong. So I'm really proud about that. But we'll continue to support for their release.
I think what was really heartwarming was how many journalists did come out and stand and publicly demonstrate in support of the Reuters journalists in a pretty difficult situation where being out and protesting could put you at risk.
Yeah, so previously, Minziar, you mentioned that when you were in Bangladesh and you were taking pictures, eventually you had to stop because you were on a tourist visa. So as a photographer, if you're in another country, not necessarily for work, but when you come across situations like this and you take pictures, is that something that you can still put out, or are like visa requirements taken into consideration? Because like, how
I,
would you get around that?
yeah, I think for your, I think you really have to consider for your own at your own expense, because like whether this is really I mean it also depends on the issue that you're trying to photograph as well. But to be honest, I think like these visa regulations are just a matter of a block for people to to be able to like report freely on issues. So this journalist visa thing shouldn't be there, but like still, if you can't, if you have to in countries that are quite sensitive, and you have to apply a journalist visa before doing a serious story, then I think it's better you try and do that first. But I think it's also when I went to Bangladesh, I thought it was a breaking news situation, and there were many other journalists who were also on tourist visas. So I thought it was going to be okay. But then what I forgot was I was coming from Myanmar, which was always like part of the story. So it was more complicated than usual, I think.
I think sometimes if you apply for a journalist visa, you may actually be denied. So I think journalists do go fully and willfully into situations on a tourist visa just to practice journalism, not just because they happen to be there. But of course, you have to be aware of the additional risk, because it gives the authorities a very easy way of shutting you down to say you have violated the terms of your visa. More questions?
Hannah, that you showed these two images in the hospital, and that kind of connected to a few things since the morning to now. One, Philippe had said that one of their colleagues who had died in Afghanistan, they were debating about what kind of an image to run, and then they decided not to show his face when the picture ran on the wire. And then you mentioned that in UK you would not get permission to be in such a situation, and here, you're faced with a very different moment. And then you file two pictures, and it's up to the editor to decide whether it runs. And then he runs both the pictures, and then now it's up to the person who's publishing to take that call. What do you think? Because you seem to lean on a picture that you showed second, which doesn't show the faces, but the other picture actually runs. What do you think is? Do you think both of them should be on the wire, and why? If both of them are saying similar things, then is the responsibility now on the person that's going to purchase the image?
I do think both should be on the wire, because I was honestly telling the story, so both situations happened. I saw both with and without the identities of the children. So, which is why I shot them and then thought about them afterwards, because I can't go back on that situation. And then I think then it is down to the news outlet if they want to use them, maybe for their own audience. Everybody has different clients and agendas. For a news picture, there's less sensitivity around what goes on the wire than maybe for places like yourself, when you were saying you would use certain pictures, maybe not showing identities. And so then that gives other people who wouldn't necessarily want to show the severity of it with or without. Does that answer your question? Sort of. Sorry.
Sorry, I just want to add a small question while the audience, someone raises their hand. When you have victims of sexual violence, women, you're working in situations where a lot of the time people may not have birth certificates or other documents which give their age. And I'm wondering if the issue of whether they are minor or major, how that is determined. Patrick, you want to have a try?
I mean, you didn't. So the question is how to determine somebody's age if they don't have proper documentation.
I think you would have a different standard of reporting on a victim of sexual violence if the victim was a minor, but
Yeah.
you may not always be able to determine that quite easily.
So we're quite strict. We Fortify Rights. We follow a lot of UNICEF's guidelines with respect to the rights of children and children being involved in any sort of truth telling or documentation process. But generally speaking, unless there's an overriding imperative, we wouldn't even interview a child, let alone a child survivor of sexual violence. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't document that type of testimony again, unless there was some sort of overriding thing, and unless the child was adamant that they wanted that. And
How do you determine whether the person is an adult or a child?
That would necessarily have to come from the community itself. Yeah.
Hi. We have a lot of students here, and obviously, a lot of them aspire to do the kind of works that you guys are doing. What are some words of caution and advice for people approaching this issue? Because, oftentimes students are pitching, we want to do refugees, we want to do sex workers, we want to, approach all these stories. It's for their final project, it's for their portfolio, they want to enter contests. And, they're approaching the subject as an assignment. What are some advice that you could give students who want to tackle these hard topics but may not be aware of some of the complicated issues?
Do your homework. Really study the subject. Make sure that your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed. One hole in your even in your caption can undermine your entire body of work. You need to take that really seriously. The context of what the image has been taken in can make or break you if you want to keep this compass in a really moral, I don't want to use the word moral, but keep your compass straight. Really don't disrespect your audience, don't disrespect, obviously, the subject matter that you're photographing, and never, ever photograph for a competition. You photograph for a competition, please, I would ask you to leave this room. Don't do that. Sorry, that was maybe a little hard. But.
Matthew?
Yeah, I would actually, depending on the level of experience that a person is bringing into a situation, if it were a situation in which someone had very little experience whatsoever, I would strongly recommend that they not try to sink their teeth into this situation, for example. It's very, very complicated. There's so many things that could go wrong. We've had even just recently, I was speaking with a quite experienced journalist who was talking to us about how she went through a whole long situation of documenting somebody's testimony, which everything was corroborated, but then at the very end, the person couldn't recall certain facts, minor facts, right? Which is a telltale sign of trauma, right? The brain has been affected in such a way that a certain part of a timeline just won't come together. And this is a really experienced person who then just thought everything that person said was a lie. And so these types of things are you have to get some experience before going into a really complicated situation like this. But I think Patrick said it best too. Just do your homework, and it's always a learning process. Even this, I mean, this morning, today, I'm learning so much from the questions and the dialogue, and so just maintaining that constantly learning is really, really important.
Can I just add to that? Don't try and do it by yourself. I've been very, very fortunate to work with some of the most credible human rights watch lawyers and journalists alike. And you learn from each other. And my first experience was in Rayong. It's a small area. It's south of in the southern tip of Burma, and that was my first real experience of the sex trade and humans trafficking and the drug trade. And yeah, we got thrown into the deep end, but what it was able to have all these questions that we've been asking ourselves. I constantly ask myself every time I do this: what am I doing it for? Why am I doing it? Who's going to benefit? These are the questions you need to ask yourself constantly. And I do it even now, 20 odd years as a photographer. I constantly questioning myself if I'm doing the right thing. Especially with somebody like Regima, I cannot tell you how much I had an argument in my own head about letting her be seen. Even though she'd been seen by herself, it was about me doing the right thing by her. I think that's important.
Minzia, would you like to add something to the question on what to advise to give to students?
Yeah, I think, of course, you have to try, like, you have to start somewhere, even though you're not experienced, but still, I think it's very important, like Patrick and Matt said, to really try and study and understand the story even before you make the trip. Because I've seen, like, over the years, like, there's some journalists who come, don't even know, like, what's the story behind, and just try get a fixer and then follow the usual, like, spots, and go back with, like, some quotes and story. But and rather than doing that, like, I think I would really recommend to try and understand the story even before you make the trip. Yeah, and also, like, it's like Patrick said, it's very important it's much better to come, like, to not do it alone. Uh, it's much better when you're assigned, or when you're working on the story with a colleague. Like, when I got in trouble in Bangladesh last year, I was super, like, fortunate that I was on assignment for Geo, and because the initial suspicion was that I was, like, I was spying for the government here, or so if I didn't have valid grounds that I was on assignment doing, doing a proper, like, reporting trip, then it would have been really, like, deep.
I think the issue of community is just so important in the media, and sometimes we as journalists undervalue it because we are in competition with each other. But I think it's becoming more and more important with the new challenges.
I mean, just going back to what you just said, Patrick, and how do you codify this in an ethics document? I think one thing I refer to quite a lot in the ethics is duty of care and minimizing harm. And that's a kind of a catch-all, is you have that responsibility. And one thing I introduced in the ethics, and I spoke to a lot of photographers, particularly photographers who'd been in that situation, and I refer to it in my slideshow, which is coming up actually, is at what point do you put the camera down? And I was very interested in your experience with the Rohingyas. So I mean, from your experiences, I can open this to everybody. I mean, you're not a first responder, you're a human being. And also, I mean, one thing I say in the ethics is that you're involved. You lift a child out of the water, then what do you do? What do you do with the child? Do you put it in the ground, or do you hand it to somebody, or what do you do? So you've had the experience on the ground, and this is something I'm asked a lot by journalism students. Where do you cross the line? What point do you say, I've got to intervene? And at what point you say, I'd like to do this, but this is not my job. So where do you cross the line, or is there a line?
A line, humanity. I think that's the line to start with, and then you dial it back from there. Yeah, okay. I'm going to go off of a tangent, but it comes back to your point. This is contemplating adopting a child, right, from a refugee camp, and it was obviously a very Western way of perspective of helping somebody. Now, okay, so I'm going to take somebody from a refugee camp. I'm going to take them to the first stage, which would be a modern town, where there's water that comes out of a faucet. How do you explain that? Well, number one. And then number two, there's cotton sheets and there's bed, and you don't speak the language. And then you've got to try and explain this. And then you take them in an aeroplane, which is like going into outer space. And then you take them to another city. And then this all multiple, you've got to dial it back, right back to the beginning. What would you add to that person's life? Okay, so I could possibly open up that person's life to a whole plethora of things, but I could actually cause more damage than good. And that decision cannot, dialing back to your point, that point of humanity, or my example is this, it's all different at every point. It never is the same. And you just got to stay, I hate to say it again, but stay true to that compass. Yes, if somebody's dying or somebody's really needs your help, you help them. I mean, take a picture of them and get them to safety, and then you get back to doing your job. But first and utmost, I mean, I couldn't live with myself. Couldn't look myself in the mirror. But if I was photographing somebody dying that I knew I could save their life, I mean, ultimately you're the one that's got to live with that.
Yeah, I think in a lot of situations, your instinct tells you without necessarily a thought process behind it. Often situations happen, and if you've got a bad feeling about it, then there's a reason behind that. And so I think common sense as well. Your safety comes first. There are situations where you do get caught up in the moment, and you want to continue, but you realise that actually your own safety is more important, and that's what you're taught on these hostile environment courses, that your life's worth more than harming yourself through taking pictures. But just what you were saying about helping people, there were situations that I was in Bangladesh, and you're taught or you're advised not to give your water away, not to give aid away, not to give food away. But as a human, when you've got children around you that are desperate, there were occasions where I would, but also you give it to one, you can't. How do you decide? So I can understand where they're coming from when they say, don't give your biscuits away, because if you've only got 3 biscuits and 30 children, that's not fair. So it's about picking your moments as well, about when to help people and how to help them. There was a few crossings of small rivers with bamboo bridges, and families coming across with babies attached to them and belongings, and they were really struggling. And so I thought, well, actually, it's more important right now for me to help these people as a human than it is as a photographer. So I did help a lot of people carrying their children across. I was sort of in the middle of them stepping off the bridge and onto dry land, so I was able to help. But then you look down the line and there's hundreds more, and you can't stand there all day. So I think it's about getting the balance right of you feeling like you've helped, but also not intervened too much.
Question there, and then there's a second question there. But this room is full of students of journalism, and you don't have questions? Come on! I'm sure your teachers are rating you on that.
Yes, well, from the things that you've been sharing, there's a lot around you as photographers, apart from Matthew, who are confronted by these people, the Rohingya. To what extent are you going through a medium of another agency, like an NGO or an organization, or, Matthew gave the example of one person sitting there getting all mic'd up and then being asked for consent, and the power imbalance in that. And then when I was listening to your story, Patrick, about Regina, I was wondering about whether you had met her through an NGO or an organization. So, and then, Hannah, when you confront these people, it sounds like it's just you as an individual, and then maybe you send the pictures back, to your institution. But to what extent are we using NGOs, services, institutions on the ground to access these people, and what impact does that have on the process that you use in order to photograph, and the power balance or imbalance?
I'm going to say a really nasty word here, but it's a real balance, because you're working for an institution. For some ways, it's propaganda. Okay, it's propaganda that the side of the fence that I want to stand on and I believe in, and I will, ultimately put my reputation on. And you have to be careful with that, and that needle will bend, but you really need to stay to your north. Now, getting back to Regima, I was working with my translator fixer, and we were just going around the camp, and I was doing this project on the survivors of Tuli Tuli, and I was constantly asking, we need to find as many people as possible. And we just asked, and we just asked, and we just literally narrowed it down, walking through and just stopping people and asking. Now, my entire body of work with the Rohingya was done under the umbrella of UNICEF, and I have quite a unique agreement with UNICEF. I get my own translator, I have my own driver, and I have total freedom. They want their pictures of kids being immunized and getting measured and stuff, which I totally agree with. Those images need to be done, but it also needs authenticity. I need to have ownership of these images, and what I mean by that is not the physicality of the monetary response from it or the compensation, but actually knowing that these images are mine and it's my voice, and it's that authenticity of your voice, that narrative, that is important to me, and that's what I mean by ownership. Now, UNICEF will use those pictures to their discretion, and I will use them to my discretion. So to build up your relationship and trust with such organizations as Fortified Rights or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty and so forth, and also publications. They need the authenticity of your voice as well. It's not just an NGO or a government institution. It's a non-government institution such as UNICEF. But your voice is important, and stick to it. I got a bit sidetracked there, I think. Sorry, I got sidetracked.
Thank you for speaking. I guess my question is more broader, based in like the historical context of photography, especially with trauma situations and crisis. How has technology impacted the way photography is used to document each coming crisis? Because there have been crises before, and we know that there will be a next crisis, 20, 30 years down the line, and unfortunately each one is different, but the reality is always in some ways very much the same. But I think the underlying difference is the technology that's being used to document that. And I feel like, do you think this intersection between technology and photography is changing the moral compass of how people define ethics? Could you talk about that as it pertains to the documentation of the Rohingya crisis, and how you anticipate it might move the needle in the future?
That's a full-fledged interview, and I hope you will follow up and do that interview while they're around today. But maybe we should narrow it down to, is technology changing
Technology has increased my workload by about 35%. It hasn't decreased it. I just want to clarify that the time I used to shoot film, I would bag it, label it, and then I would have meetings and I would talk to people about what was happening in camps or on borders or the situation and gather more information. That doesn't happen now. I'm stuck at my laptop processing images because people think the immediacy is important. And I totally agree with the immediacy, but it's not the end game. For me, it's about having the narrative as accurate as possible and dealing and keeping that. So digitized world it's made things very fluid, but it doesn't mean the storytelling has changed any. It's still the same laws that govern it, in my view.
Matthew, you want to address especially the part about does it shift the moral compass to be so dependent on technology?
I mean, I think with the increased access to technology, there definitely comes more responsibilities. But I found myself thinking of conversations we were having with the diplomatic community when, while villages were getting burned down and while, children are being thrown into fires and we're documenting mass rape and killings and massacres, and we're bringing that information to governments, to government officials. And one of the first responses consistently that we got from diplomats was, why is there no video evidence? And it was such a jarring moment because, we had, and this been the case that I'm thinking of, we had just come from the border where, there's evidence coming out of the border, right? But what these particular individuals wanted was the act of killing on film. And actually, I had a conversation with a legal professional in the U.S., just sharing my own frustrations, and he actually said, if the threshold, and he was talking from the perspective of American courts, but it would maintain anywhere. But he said if the threshold of holding somebody accountable for murder was that you had to capture the act of killing on video, there wouldn't be a single conviction anywhere, right? But what diplomats were bringing to, what they were projecting onto the situation was, well, I have my iPhone in my pocket, and if I saw something, I would just film it, right? So I think there's that aspect of technology where now we're in a situation where, at Fortify Rights, we can receive video that has evidentiary value and we can release it and it can lead to people being held accountable. But the flip side to that is that now certain people in the international community are like, yeah, well, if we don't see it on somebody's iPhone or smartphone, then did it really happen? And this has been a really in this particular thing, it's been agonizing, but not I don't mean agonizing for us, for Rohingya communities, members of the Rohingya community that are going themselves, and we've facilitated some of it, and they're going to talk to government officials, and those officials are asking them, well, is there video? And meanwhile, they're asking that to somebody whose family members had been killed or burned out of their homes, right? So that's a situation of trauma, and there are ethical things there as well. So it's and from the side of being a researcher and documenting human rights violations, there are also ethics to having to ask that question. In this day and age, there is an imperative to ask that question. Did anybody film it? It's a terrible thing to have to ask somebody who just survived a massacre, for example, but for the purposes of documenting evidence. So there are many layers to it, I guess, is what I'm getting at there.
Can I just add to that? Me and Matt were talking earlier on. It was an interesting case. It was I'm not quite 100% clear on my dates, but it was either a G8 or a G5 summit in Vancouver, and there was a riot that broke out, and there was a photograph taken over the shoulders of some policemen with riot shielders, and in the background was the rioters. And turned out to be an Australian guy picking up his girlfriend who had slipped over, and he kissed her. Now, it all came out, it's fake, it was a setup, it was all of a setup. It only became factual, it only became real until somebody posted a video of the event from an elevated position from a car park. So the inflation of evidence, which Matt is talking about now, a photograph is not longer viable. You now need to have video evidence. And what's the next stage? It's this evolution of technology. Is it causing? It's causing an inflation in evidence, in my view.
We're nearly out of time. Minzia, do you want to say something before we close the session?
No, I was just going to add, I think it's also really a balance of whether you're trying to provide evidence, or you're trying to provide evidence, or you're trying to really communicate at an emotional level. I think it also depends on the purpose and the nature of the story. But regarding technology, I've realized that like for example, in this covering the Rohingya crisis, there's a lot more like drone coverage, or there's a lot like there's some like virtual reality coverage. But I think it all comes down to, in my point of view, that what the most important thing is the story and how it will be told in in the most powerful way, how best you can tell the story, and try to like use the technology as a tool. I think that would be good.
Thanks, Minziar, and I'm really glad the technology in use today has allowed you to be with us throughout the session. So I'm going to bring it to a close now. Apologies to the young man. I was trying to give a chance to those who hadn't asked a question, but hopefully you're heading towards journalism and will ask them over tea. Thank you very much to the panelists for a very interesting session.